In the Bible, the name of God seems like a key, but also a closed door. It is not just a label. In the ancient world, the name of a deity expressed character, authority, and presence. That is why when Moses encountered the burning bush that was not consumed, he did not ask, "Who are you?" but rather, "What is your name?" In that seemingly administrative detail, a huge tension was hidden. If you knew the name, you could invoke it. If you could invoke it, you could recognize it as the true God and distinguish it from the gods of Egypt. The answer Moses receives in Exodus 3:14 is strange even for an ancient text. God does not give a common name. He says, "I am who I am." In Hebrew, it appears as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, a phrase that sounds more like a definition than a proper name, as if God was saying, "Do not reduce me to a word. My identity cannot fit into a human label." But immediately afterward, the text becomes more concrete. God says that this "I am" is connected to the name by which he will be remembered forever, and there appears the great mystery, the Tetragrammaton. HHWH, 4 Hebrew letters, Yod, He, Vav, and He, which in many Bibles are translated as Lord in all capitals. It is the proper name of the God of Israel, but written in a way that seems designed not to be pronounced. Ancient biblical Hebrew was written without vowels. Over the centuries, the pronunciation ceased to be transmitted normally, and the name became so sacred that, in public reading, it was replaced by titles, Adonai or Lord, and Elohim or God. When scribes copied the text, they treated it as something delicate, almost dangerous. It was not just any sound, it was the name. Here arises the problem that persists to this day. If no one pronounces it, how can we know what it sounded like? At some point, the Masoretes, scribes, and guardians of the tradition added vowel markings to the texts to fix the reading, but in the case of YHWH, they often inserted the vowels of Adonai as a reminder that it should be read as Lord, not the name. Centuries later, some readers took that hybrid combination as if it were the actual pronunciation, and thus the form Jehovah appeared in certain Western traditions. In parallel, most modern scholars consider the vocalization Yahweh more likely, based on linguistic clues, theophoric names such as Yeshayahu, Isaiah, which contain an abbreviated form of the name, and ancient references suggesting a verbal structure related to be or to exist, but likely is not the same as certain. There are commandments that protect the name from trivial use, promises that the name is a refuge, and scenes where the name is associated with a presence that fills the temple and overflows language. In the New Testament, moreover, the problem is amplified. The God of Israel is proclaimed in Greek, and the Tetragrammaton almost disappears behind Kyrios, or Lord, leaving an uncomfortable question open. Was the exact sound lost, or was it deliberately hidden? 1. The Behemoth. In the book of Job, when the narrative has already passed through pain, silence, and fruitless debate, a different scene emerges. God responds, but not with an explanation. He responds with a parade of images from nature, as if creation itself were the argument. And in the midst of this catalogue, a creature appears that seems taken from a world prior to history, the behemoth. It is not an abstract symbol presented as such. It is described with physical details, habits, muscular strength, and territory. Job 40 presents it as a work of God like you, that is, a creature within the same created order as humans. It eats grass like an ox, suggesting a large herbivore. It dwells near water, in the reeds, in the marshes, and remains unperturbed if the river rises and strikes it. In its neck there is strength, in its belly there is power. Its bones are like tubes of bronze, its limbs like bars of iron. The description aims to impress. It is not only large, it is immovable. And then comes the phrase that has sparked interpretations for centuries: it moves its tail like a cedar. That comparison to the cedar is at the heart of the problem. For a modern reader, it sounds like an animal with a huge, rigid tail, like a tree trunk, and this has led, especially in recent times, some to associate it with sauropod dinosaurs, enormous long-necked herbivores with massive tails. The image fits popular imagination, a prehistoric giant hidden in an ancient text, a clue to a lost world. But this interpretation runs into several difficulties. The poetic language of the Book of Job is highly figurative. The context does not necessarily suggest pre-flood fauna preserved, and moreover there is a detail that troubles anyone seeking an exact equivalence. Behemoth lives in accessible rivers and marshes in a geography that the text assumes is familiar. Then arises the classical alternative, the hippopotamus. It is a large, herbivorous animal naturally associated with rivers and reeds, dangerous and hard to tame. The idea that it fears not the Jordan fits a creature that withstands currents and submerges. Also fitting is the emphasis on its brute strength and practical invulnerability to humans. However, the hippopotamus has one problem. Its tail is not like a cedar. It is short, thin, and does not inspire that comparison. Those who defend the hippopotamus reading argue that the phrase could refer not to the size of the tail, but to its rigidity or movement, or even to another part of the body due to a translation ambiguity. Others maintain that tail could be a euphemism, an indirect way of referring to reproductive power, as occurs in other ancient texts. In that case, the image of the cedar does not describe length, but vigor. A third proposal is the elephant. Its strength and size fit the portrait of power, and the elephant was known indirectly in the ancient Near East. But the elephant is not a swamp animal that reposes under the lotuses and in the river's hiding places, with the naturalness suggested in Job. There is also the buffalo or wild ox, but there the relationship with water and the image of an almost untamable colossus weakens. It is as if each candidate fits part of the description and fails in another. That is why some scholars return to the beginning and ask a different question. What if behemoth is not meant to be an exact zoological specimen? The name itself suggests beast in the superlative, an intensive plural form that can mean the great beast. In ancient Near Eastern literature and biblical texts, there are figures of chaos represented by enormous creatures associated with the sea or the untamed. Behemoth could be the terrestrial counterpart to that chaos, just as Leviathan would represent the marine. Under this reading, God is not teaching biology. He is showing sovereignty. Even what seems monstrous to humans, even what appears to be a symbol of disorder, is within the reach of the Creator. 2. The rich city of Ophir. Ophir appears in the Bible as a name that functions almost as a synonym for wealth. It is not just another place. It is the source of proverbially fine gold, cited along with treasures and luxury in poems and prophecies, and associated with the maritime expeditions of Solomon's kingdom. But when one tries to locate it on a map, the mystery becomes immediate. No one can point with certainty to where Ophir was, not even whether it was a port city, a broad region, or a commercial label for a trading circuit. The texts that most fuel the enigma are in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. There, a naval alliance between Solomon and Hiram of Tyre is described. The Phoenicians contributed maritime expertise, and from a Red Sea port linked to Ezion-Geber, the ships went and returned with large quantities of gold brought from Ophir. Shipments of valuable woods, such as almug, algum, and precious stones are also mentioned, and a luxury trade that enhanced the kingdom's prestige is suggested. However, this account has a weak point. It is brief on coordinates and rich in grandiloquence, which opens the door to two opposing readings: an actual trade with a real destination, or a literary motif to explain the image of a Solomon overflowing with wealth. The tradition of research has moved over centuries within a triangle of possibilities: Southern Arabia, Eastern Africa, and India. The Encyclopaedia Britannica summarizes the state of the question clearly. Many have proposed locations on the Arabian Peninsula as Ophir, and as overseas alternatives, Eastern Africa and India often appear. This wide range of proposals says more about the problem than about the answer. The goods listed in the biblical account can be associated with various ancient routes of the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, and do not require a single solution. Those who support an Arabian Ophir point to southern Arabia, areas of Yemen and Oman, due to their relationship with incense, early maritime trade, and natural proximity to the Red Sea. Even specific regions like Dhofar have been mentioned in this constellation of hypotheses. This line has an advantage. It does not require impossible voyages for the technology of the time, and fits with trade networks that linked the Levant, Arabia, and the Horn of Africa. But it also has a problem. Southern Arabia is still enormous, and there is no universally accepted archaeological identification that says this was Ophir. The African option usually looks toward the eastern coast and relies on the idea of an exchange of metals, ivory, and exotic goods. The Indian option, on the other hand, gains strength when considering the Phoenician horizon and the routes that, at least in later periods, connected the Red Sea with the subcontinent, as well as the possible explanation for rare products such as aromatic woods. Both proposals, however, share the same weakness. They rely on reconstructions of routes and commercial analogies rather than on proof tying the biblical name to a specific site. The closest thing to material evidence of the name does not solve the map, but it does intensify the mystery. An ostracon, that is, a fragment of pottery with an inscription, found in the Tel Aviv area mentions gold of Ophir in a context of payment or delivery, commonly dated to the Iron Age. This suggests that Ophir circulated as a real reference in economic language. It was a recognizable origin, or at least a commercial quality mark. The fragment proves that the term was not pure late fantasy, but it does not indicate where Ophir was located. 3. The year of Jesus' birth. The Western calendar has been revolving for 2 millennia around a date that paradoxically was never precisely recorded in the very accounts of the birth. The Gospels do not say in such a year or in such a month. They do not give an official figure, do not fix a season, do not leave a marginal note, and yet around that absence an entire era was built before and after Christ. The mystery begins there. If the heart of Christian history is so central, why was its date left floating? The first clue comes from the place where the Gospels do seem to be concrete, the political framework. Matthew associates the birth with the reign of Herod the Great. That narrows the margin because Herod died near the turn of the era and most historical reconstructions place him in 4 BC. If Jesus was born in the days of Herod, then he must have been born before that death. It seems simple, until the second Gospel opens with the infancy narrative, Luke. Luke also mentions Herod, but adds a detail that complicates everything. He connects the birth with a census during the authority of Quirinius in Syria. The problem is that Quirinius' census is well documented around 6 AD, when Rome reorganized Judea as a province, and this measure caused disturbances. That separates the two references by almost a decade. If one takes both data literally, the year of birth becomes impossible. Either Jesus was born before 4 BC or around 6 AD, but he cannot meet both conditions at the same time. From there, the debate splits like a river. One branch holds that Luke was mistaken in linking the birth to that specific census, and that his intention was theological or narrative rather than chronological. Another branch tries to harmonize, that Luke was speaking of an earlier record, that first can be understood differently, or that Quirinius had some prior role in the region before the famous census of year 6. There are linguistic, historical, and apologetic arguments, but there is no definitive piece that closes the case, and so the census becomes a hinge. Depending on how it is read, it pushes you toward one decade or another. The third clue does not come from the birth, but from the beginning of public life. Luke says that Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his ministry, and anchors the beginning of John the Baptist in the 15th year of Emperor Tiberius. Many calculations place that 15th year around 28 and 29 AD. If Jesus was about 30 at that time, then his birth would fall around 1 BC approximately. But that window clashes again with Herod if the 4 BC date is maintained, and with the elasticity of about 30, which can be a broad approximation, not an exact figure. The text seems to suggest age, but does not require mathematical exactness. On top of all this comes a later layer, the decision of when the year 1 begins. Dionysius Exiguus in the 6th century popularized the Anno Domini system for counting years from the Incarnation, but his exact method was not entirely clear, and many historians consider that the computation may have been shifted by several years. That is to say, even if today we said Jesus was born in year 1, we would be repeating a convention that could be, without knowing it, correcting an old count made with incomplete information. 4. The location of Noah's Ark. Few biblical scenes left such a famous and at the same time so useless geographical clue for a map. Genesis does not say that the ark rested on Mount Ararat, singular, but rather in the mountains of Ararat. That subtle difference is the first crack in the mystery. Ararat in the Bible may refer to Urartu, an ancient kingdom and a broad mountainous region around the Armenian plateau, not necessarily to a specific peak. Over the centuries, however, Christian imagination and popular tradition ended up fixing a concrete mountain, the large volcanic massif now known as Mount Ararat, the highest point in present-day Turkey. Enormous, snow-capped, visible from afar, perfect for becoming the final stage of an epic story. Even modern reference sources point to it as the place traditionally associated with the ark's resting place, and explain that the biblical name is linked to Urartu. But that traditional association was not always unanimous. In late antiquity, another location circulated strongly, Mount Judi in southeastern Turkey near Upper Mesopotamia. The interesting thing about Judi is not that it appeared as a late whim, but that it has backing in very early traditions, Syriac-speaking Christian sources and later Islamic ones, where the Quran explicitly mentions that the ship settled on Judi. In some currents of antiquity, that identification became so dominant that, according to historical summaries, it persisted for centuries before the focus shifted to modern Ararat in the Middle Ages. That rivalry between Ararat and Judi is not a simple two options. It is a window into how sacred geographies are constructed, a mix of text, local memory, pilgrimage, and the human need to point to an exact spot where a story touched land. And in that need, a constant phenomenon appears: expeditions, rumors, fossilized wood, blurry photographs, finds that fizzle out in the same pattern. National Geographic sums up the general tone of these modern searches. The story of the Ark inspired many to track Ararat and other areas of eastern Turkey, but the collection of attempts clashes with a basic problem of evidence and expectation, as if the myth were more resilient than any proof. In the 20th century, the mystery took the form of a concrete site with a proper name, Durupinar, a boat-shaped formation near Dogubayazit, promoted for decades as the petrified mold of the Ark. It is the kind of place that seems made for faith. It has a silhouette, measurements that some compare to Genesis, and is near the symbolic Ararat. But when the record is examined, the story becomes more prosaic. From the first official studies that excavated and concluded there were no visible archaeological remains, to later geological evaluations describing Durupina as a natural structure, not a vessel. The most compelling piece of that critique is that it does not come only from skeptics, but from a technical work published in a geoscience education journal which argues that the ship can be explained by layers, minerals, and common geological structures, and that several popular proofs do not hold up under microscopic and contextual analysis. 5. The Lost Books of the Bible. There is a type of biblical mystery that does not depend on prophecies or giant creatures, but on something simpler: titles. The Bible, in several passages, cites works that today do not exist in any library. Sometimes it does so as if saying, "This is written in such and such a record," with complete naturalness, as if the reader could consult it. But that reader no longer exists. What remains is the trace, the name of a lost book, nailed into the text like a footnote without a page. The most well-known example is the book of Jasher, or Jashar. It is mentioned in Joshua when recalling the poetic scene of the sun and the moon stopping, and it appears again in 2 Samuel in relation to a funeral song of David. What is striking is that the context itself suggests it was not a history book in the modern sense, but a collection of songs or poems about memorable events. And yet what circulates today under that name in some circles is not a recovered original, but later texts claiming to be it, with serious doubts about their authenticity. The result is awkward. There is the biblical reference to an ancient Jasher, but what we have are much later and debatable candidates. Another even more enigmatic title is the Book of the Wars of YHWH. In Numbers 21:14, the text introduces a quote and attributes it to that book, as if it were a songbook or record of campaigns. Again, what survives in the Bible is barely a poetic fragment embedded in the narrative. Was it a military chronicle, an anthology of victory poems, an official archive? The proposals vary, but the central fact does not change. The Bible treats it as a known source, and today no copy remains. That category also includes several books cited in Kings and Chronicles, Annals, Chronicles, and Records of Kings. Phrases like, "Is it not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah?" sound like royal bureaucracy, scribes recording decisions, wars, public works, intrigues, and tributes. The problem is that those archives did not survive as an independent book in the biblical transmission. Perhaps they were lost in wars, fires, and exiles. Perhaps they were absorbed and rewritten by later authors. Perhaps they were never a single book, but dispersed court scrolls. In that same list appears the Book of the Acts of Solomon, mentioned as if it contained more details about his reign. Also mentioned are writings attributed to prophets or seers in language suggesting sources used by the compilers. That is to say, at certain moments the Bible reveals its own editorial workshop. It does not fall from the sky as a uniform block. It is fed by traditions, poems, records, and memoirs. And then a common confusion arises. Lost books is not the same as apocrypha. Apocryphal, in a broad sense, is religious literature that remained outside an accepted canon, and its history is long. Some texts were valued, then debated, and finally excluded from certain canonical lists. Added to this is pseudepigraphy, works attributed to ancient figures that circulated as expansions, reinterpretations, or devotional literature. These texts, unlike the lost books, often did survive in manuscripts, even if they do not appear in all Bibles. 6. The identities of Gog and Magog. Gog and Magog enter the Bible as a pair of names that seem to come from a map, but behave like an omen. In Genesis 10, Magog appears in the Table of Nations as a descendant of Japheth, within a genealogy that attempts to order the known world after the flood. There are no monsters or visions there, just a name among many, enough to suggest that Magog was understood as a real people or territory within the ancient imagination. The twist comes with Ezekiel 38-39. In that oracle, Gog is presented as a leader associated with Meshech and Tubal and linked to the land of Magog. The scene is grand. A coalition of peoples gathers from different points and advances against Israel like a cloud in an attack that ends not by human strategy but by divine intervention. The prophecy is not written as a chronicle of a specific battle, but as the climax of a future where Israel has already been restored and the final enemy becomes the instrument to show that God rules even over disaster. Here begins the debate over identity. Was Ezekiel pointing to a specific historical figure, or was he using northern names as a symbol of distant danger? Some tried to identify Gog with known figures from the ancient world. A classic hypothesis links him to Gyges, king of Lydia, because there are linguistic echoes and Assyrian references to the land of Gyges. But even when that connection is debated, the important thing is the pattern. The prophecy invites reading Gog as a name that may sound historical without being tied to a birth record. In antiquity, one identification gained enormous popularity: Magog as the Scythians. Flavius Josephus himself writes that Magog was the ancestor of the Magogites, called by the Greeks Scythians, establishing the idea that the name pointed to northern peoples, nomadic and feared beyond civilized borders. That phrase functioned as a cultural compass. It does not indicate exact coordinates, but pushes Gog and Magog into the imagination of the far north and the barbarian peoples. With the New Testament, the mystery doubles. In Revelation 20, Gog and Magog cease to be Gog of the land of Magog to become a collective name. Nations from the four corners of the earth that rise at the end in the last attempt to besiege the people of God. By then, it no longer matters if Magog was a clan in Genesis or a region in Ezekiel. The text repurposes them as an apocalyptic label for the universal enemy, the final enemy. This plasticity explains why, over the centuries, Gog and Magog were relocated again and again. Jewish and Christian writers associated them with changing peoples according to the fears of the moment: Scythians, Goths, Huns, Mongols, and in Islamic tradition they appear as Ya'juj and Ma'juj, devastating forces contained by a barrier, destined to break forth as a sign of the end. 7. The lost years of Jesus. They are called the lost years, but the emptiness is not total. It is a selective silence. The Gospels show Jesus in his childhood, then focus sharply on him at 12 years old in Jerusalem, and then we only encounter him again when he begins his public ministry, already about 30. Between these two moments lies a vast stretch, almost 2 decades, where the canonical text barely offers a single summary line and no episodes. The last frame before the silence is in Luke. Jesus travels with his family for Passover, stays in the temple, converses with teachers, and his parents find him after days of searching. The scene has something of a hinge. Jesus is still a child within his household, but he already appears with awareness of a mission that exceeds his family. Luke closes that episode with a phrase that seems deliberately general. The boy returns to Nazareth, lives under his parents, and grew in wisdom and stature, nothing more. That final sentence sounds like a summary that covers an entire album. Then suddenly the narrative jumps. Luke provides another detail, but now chronological. When Jesus began his ministry, he was about 30 years old. That relative precision is enough to indicate maturity while leaving the exact age slightly vague. That, approximately, is the kind of detail that sparks theories, because the text does not deny that things happened, it simply chooses not to tell them. What could have occurred during those years? The simplest reading is also the oldest. Ordinary life. Nazareth was not the center of the world. It was a village, and the story suggests that Jesus was known by a trade. In Mark, people identify him as the carpenter, in Matthew as the carpenter's son. The Greek term may have a broader meaning than the modern carpenter, a craftsman or builder who worked with wood and also with stone, someone involved in construction and repairs. That image does not remove the mystery, but it gives it texture. Years of routine, family, work, learning, silent observation. The problem is that the biblical silence did not remain empty for long. From very early on, stories circulated to complete his childhood. Apocryphal texts such as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which claims to narrate episodes between ages 5 and 12 and fill the gap with striking, sometimes strange miracles, which the mainstream churches eventually rejected as non-canonical. That impulse shows something human. When a character is central, people do not tolerate gaps and create continuity. Later, the gap between 12 and 30 became fertile ground for even grander legends, journeys of Jesus to India, Kashmir, or Tibet, learning from Eastern sages, secret manuscripts in monasteries. One of the most cited stories comes from the Russian Nicholas Notovich, who claimed to have found a text in the Himalayas about Isa. But his account was widely discredited as a fraud, and even so continued to fuel esoteric currents and modern reinterpretations of the hidden Jesus. 8. The place of Jesus' crucifixion. The Gospels say that Jesus was crucified in a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull, and translated into Greek as cranion, in Latin Calvaria. But that label provides no coordinates. It only leaves breadcrumbs. It was outside the city, close enough for people to come and go, and in John there is a key detail. Near the place there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb. With these elements, the story becomes an archaeological quest to find a point that, in the 1st century, was outside the walls and that at the same time ended up swallowed by urban growth. The oldest and most dominant tradition places the site within the current Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Old City of Jerusalem. This identification was consolidated in the 4th century, when, under Constantine, the recognition of places linked to the Passion and the tomb was promoted, and a large worship complex was built. A striking point is that before that basilica, the area had been intervened by Rome. Several historical and archaeological sources indicate that in the time of Hadrian, a pagan temple was erected there, to Venus or to Jupiter Venus, according to tradition, and that during excavations and construction in the Constantinian period, earlier layers were removed. This fact opens two opposing interpretations. For some, the Roman temple would have been a way to cover a venerated place. For others, it shows that the site was so altered that the later identification could rely more on religious memory than on verifiable evidence. What keeps the Holy Sepulchre's claim strong is not only tradition but also the profile of the terrain. Various studies describe that this area had been a limestone quarry in earlier times and that by the 1st century it had ceased to be exploited, remaining as a marginal space outside the urban core suitable for gardens and rock-cut tombs. This transition from quarry to peripheral funerary area fits well with the type of landscape suggested by the accounts, a place of execution near a road and a short distance away, a tomb. Even so, the mystery does not dissipate because fitting is not the same as proving. And that is why there is a second candidate that, since the 19th century, has attracted many pilgrims, Gordon's Calvary and the Garden Tomb near the Damascus Gate. There is a rock outcrop that some have interpreted as a skull and a tomb in a landscaped environment. But academic criticism has been consistent. The New Testament does not say that Jesus died on top of a hill, and several studies argue that the Garden Tomb, based on its typological features, seems to belong to earlier periods, which would clash with the idea of the new tomb in the Gospels. Moreover, although the site functions powerfully as a devotional space, scholarly support for considering it the historical site of the crucifixion has generally been weak. 9. The name of the Witch of Endor. In 1 Samuel 28, Saul is cornered. The Philistine army is gathering. Samuel has died, and God does not answer him, neither through dreams, nor through prophets, nor through the Urim. So the king does what he himself had forbidden in his kingdom. He seeks out a woman possessor of an obi in Endor, a medium, a practitioner of necromancy. The account is direct, almost uncomfortable, but there is one detail that turns this figure into a permanent mystery. Her name is never mentioned. She is remembered for her function and her location, not for her identity. The Bible presents her with a technical expression, a woman possessor of an ob in Endor. That ob is, in academic discussion, an obscure word. It can refer to a familiar spirit, a ritual object, or even a method of consultation that involved a pit or conduit to bring up the dead. What matters for the mystery of the name is that the text does not call her sorceress as a personal nickname, but as a legal and religious category, someone who practices the forbidden. In the Septuagint, the nuance becomes even more particular. It describes her as engastrimuthos, the one who speaks from the belly, a Greek term associated with mediums and ventriloquism. The Latin Vulgate uses a word linked to pagan oracles. Languages change, but the pattern repeats. Technique and label, not proper name. The silence about her name becomes more striking because the account does pay attention to identities elsewhere. Saul goes in disguise. The woman, at first, suspects a trap and remembers that the king himself expelled necromancers. Then, at the moment of the apparition, she seems to recognize him and reacts with a scream, as if the scene were slipping out of her control. It is a passage charged with moral tension, and yet the woman remains anonymous, as if the text wants the reader not to cling to her as a character, but to see her as a mirror of Saul's collapse. This absence of a name opened the door to traditions that tried to fill the gap. In medieval commentaries and compilations, the idea appears that the medium was the mother of Abner, Saul's commander, an identification attributed in tradition to works such as the Yalkut Shimoni. This is not information that comes from the biblical text, but a later effort to insert the woman into a network of known characters, as if anonymity were intolerable and a biography had to be given to domesticate the episode. Rabbinic Judaism, for its part, discussed not only who she was, but what actually occurred. Some readings hold that Samuel did appear, others explore whether there was deception, illusion, or spiritual mediation. Even there, where the episode is dissected in detail, the proper name remains missing. Tradition debates the mechanism, the permission, the fear, the prohibition, but the woman remains the one from Endor, a figure defined by the place of the act, not by her personal identity. 10. The location of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is perhaps the most famous biblical mystery that seems to have been deliberately left with a solvable clue. Genesis does not just say there was a garden, but relates it to geography. From Eden flowed a river that then split into 4 branches, and it names 2 that still exist on modern maps, Tigris and Euphrates. The problem is that this detail, instead of closing the case, opens it like a wound. If 2 rivers are identifiable, why are the other 2, Pishon and Gihon, not? The most immediate reading places the story in Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, because Tigris and Euphrates crossed that region and were axes of civilization from very early on. But there the first logical obstacle appears. In current geography, Tigris and Euphrates do not flow from a single river that then splits into 4. They arise in nearby areas of the Anatolian plateau, yes, but as separate rivers. The encyclopedic tradition itself acknowledges this friction. The Genesis scheme does not fit literally with the modern map, and the proposed identifications for Gihon show how elastic the attempt to fit it becomes. Then a hypothesis with archaeological and geographical strength emerges. The head of the Persian Gulf, that is, the northern end of the Gulf in lower Mesopotamia, where the great rivers reach the sea. That theory proposes that before climate changes and sea level shifts, there could have been a fertile plain now submerged or transformed, and that Eden could point to that corridor of fertility and water. It does not prove an exact point, but it explains why tradition continues to look to southeastern Mesopotamia as the main candidate. The second major front of the mystery is the two phantom rivers. Genesis says that the Pishon encircled the land of Havilah, where there is gold, and that the Gihon encircled the land of Cush. But Havilah and Cush are not simple coordinates. National Geographic summarizes the problem precisely. Havilah is usually located in southern Arabia, a region associated with metals and wealth, while Cush is ambiguous because in the Bible the name is used for two different areas, one in Mesopotamia and another in Africa, around Nubia. If Cush can be Africa or Asia, then Gihon could be an African river or an Asian one, and the map falls apart. That is why, even in antiquity, macro solutions appeared. The historian Josephus went as far as identifying Gihon with the Nile, and some ancient schemes paired Pishon with enormous rivers like the Ganges, although that line clashes with the fact that Tigris and Euphrates are thousands of kilometers away. In other words, the more you try to make the text cover giant known rivers, the more you lose the geographical coherence of the whole. 11. The Leviathan. There are biblical creatures that seem designed to stay in the grey area between zoology and myth, and Leviathan is the queen of that territory. Its name appears in very different texts, sometimes as a fearsome animal, sometimes as a sea monster, sometimes as a political symbol, and in an almost ironic tone as something God plays with in the sea. That variety makes the question, what was Leviathan, never have a single answer, because the biblical usage itself refuses to fix it. The longest passage is in Job 41. There God challenges Job with an impressive description of a being impossible to tame. It cannot be caught with a hook, nor pierced with harpoons, as if it were common prey. The text details strength, tough skin, teeth, and a presence that inspires fear. In some modern translations and study notes, that Leviathan is understood as a crocodile, not because the word literally always means that, but because the portrait fits a large aquatic reptile from the environment. The proof of this discussion is that certain versions even place crocodile directly in the text to guide the reader. But here the problem arises. Job also describes a breath that seems to ignite coals or come out like a flame, images that sound like poetic hyperbole or a mythological monster rather than a real crocodile. When Leviathan appears in the Psalms, the tension changes color. In Psalm 74 it is mentioned with heads and as an enemy defeated by God, language that recalls a cosmic battle against chaos. In Psalm 104, on the other hand, Leviathan appears as a sea creature, part of the created order. It is as if the same name serves two functions, primordial terror and, at the same time, a piece of the ecosystem under divine control. That oscillation makes it almost impossible to decide whether we are facing a real animal exalted by poetry or a mystical symbol tamed by theology. The text that pushes the mystery toward the apocalyptic is Isaiah 27:1. There Leviathan is the swift serpent, the twisting serpent, and God kills it with his sword. It no longer sounds like fauna, it sounds like an emblem. Encyclopedia Britannica summarizes that duality accurately. In Isaiah, it is a symbol of Israel's enemies. In Job, it is a sea monster and a sign of God's creative power. And then the most explosive connection appears. Many studies compare Leviathan with Lotan, the serpentine monster of Ugaritic myths, a typical figure of the combat against chaos present in several cultures of the ancient Near East. Under that reading, the Bible would be taking a known mythical language, the sea monster, to affirm another idea. It is not Baal nor Marduk who defeats chaos. It is YHWH who creates, rules, and destroys at will. 12. The fate of the giants. In the Bible, the giants appear as an intermittent presence. They show up suddenly before the flood, disappear in the catastrophe, and yet they resurface centuries later in accounts of conquest and war. That back and forth is the mystery. If the flood was a total reset, how is it that the text mentions giants again in Canaan, in Bashan, or among the Philistines? The first core is in Genesis 6:1-4, where the Nephilim are mentioned in the context of the sons of God and the daughters of men. There they are linked to the Gibborim, which meant heroes or men of renown. The problem is that Nephilim is not a transparent label. Its exact meaning is debated, and the translation giants comes from ancient versions but does not exhaust the sense. Some readings understand them as fallen or violent ones, more associated with martial reputation than physical height. Then comes the flood. The narrative seems to suggest a radical cleansing of the corrupt world. And yet, in Numbers 13, the spies returning from Canaan claim to have seen Nephilim and describe themselves as grasshoppers in comparison. It is a phrase that can be read as literal testimony or as an exaggeration of fear, internal propaganda, or panic language. The crucial detail is that the text does not explain how they survived. It only records that the rumor exists and paralyzes the people. From there, the term giants spreads across families and peoples: Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim. In Deuteronomy, territories are mentioned where these groups formerly lived, and a nearly cinematic character appears. Ogei, king of Bashan, described as a remnant of the Rephaim, with a huge bed mentioned as a material detail to underline size and threat. The text suggests that, at least in Israelite memory, there were enclaves of enormous people linked to specific regions of the Transjordan. Later in the Davidic cycle, the echo returns: Goliath and other tall warriors in the Philistine sphere. And here the mystery becomes double, because giant in Hebrew can come from various words and does not always mean the same thing. Sometimes it designates ancient peoples, sometimes violent heroes, sometimes specters or shadows in poetic uses. That is, the language may be mixing biology, ethnic memory, and symbolism. That is why explanations compete. One says the pre-flood giants were annihilated, and the later giants are just tall clans or formidable warriors, called so by comparison or oral tradition. Another tries a more literal harmonization, that the lineage reappeared through new unions or indirect survivals. And a third relies on Second Temple Jewish literature. There, works like 1 Enoch and related traditions narrate that the giants were destroyed, but their spirits remained as malevolent forces. The Book of Giants, with fragments found at Qumran, expands that story, as if the fate of the giants was not just to die, but to transform into a spiritual threat. 13. The ages of the biblical centenarian characters. In Genesis, there is a stretch where human life seems to belong to another kind of time. Adam reaches 930 years, Jared 962, Methuselah 969, Noah 950. These are not isolated figures. They form an ordered series in genealogies that follow a repetitive pattern, indicating how many years the different characters lived, how many children they had, and the final count of their days. This way of writing suggests intention. It is not a casual detail, but a structure designed to convey something. And here the mystery arises. What do these ages really represent? A common ancient explanation still held by many believers is literal. Before the flood, the world was different and longevity was possible. In this reading, the fall, corruption, and then the judgment of the flood mark the beginning of a progressive decline. In fact, the text itself seems to sketch a slope. After the flood, ages remain high but decrease with each generation until they approach more human ranges. The genealogy functions as both a moral and biological thermometer. Time shortens, but there are other lines of interpretation that cannot be ignored. One points to numerology. Several authors have noted that the figures in Genesis 5 do not feel random like a modern record, but show regularities and preferences for certain numerical endings, which could hint at a compositional and symbolic scheme. From this perspective, the numbers would be a way of constructing memory and meaning, magnifying a primordial era while simultaneously giving it order. Another explanation explores whether there was a confusion of units, months instead of years, for example. This is tempting because converting 969 months would give around 78 years, something believable. The problem is that, applied across the series, the idea breaks other figures. Some patriarchs would have children at absurdly low ages. For this reason, even where this hypothesis is mentioned, it is usually presented as a speculative possibility, not a global solution. The most technical point, and at the same time the most devastating for anyone seeking an exact date, is that the ages change according to textual tradition. The Masoretic Hebrew text, the Greek Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch do not always give the same years at fatherhood, or the same totals, especially in Genesis 5 and 11. This means that very early on there were variations in the numbers, and these variations affect any chronology that tries to sum generations as if they were civil registry data. There are studies dedicated solely to comparing these chronologies and discussing which best preserves the original form. Finally, there is a cultural clue. In Mesopotamia, lists of antediluvian kings circulated with reigns of thousands or tens of thousands of years. Compared to that, the biblical ages are enormous, yes, but also domesticated. They seem hyperbolized without completely detaching from the human. Some researchers suggest that Genesis engages with that world. It takes the language of extreme longevity, but reframes it within a genealogy with moral and theological purpose. 14. The fate of the lost tribes of Israel. The mystery of the lost tribes arises from a short and brutal phrase. The king of Assyria took Samaria and deported part of Israel, relocating them to regions of the empire. The biblical text even lists destinations like Halah, Gozan, along the river Habor, and the cities of the Medes, as if leaving an address. But those addresses over time turned to smoke. There is no list of names, no biblical record of their return, and the identity of those tribes seems to dissolve into the imperial landscape. Historically, the Assyrian mechanism helps to understand why they were lost. Assyria did not deport solely to punish, they deported to control. Their resettlement policy moved entire populations, fragmented communities, mixed ethnicities and languages, and repopulated strategic territories with people from elsewhere. It was a form of state social engineering. If you separated a people from their land, you weakened them as a center of rebellion. With this method, the northern tribes could survive biologically, but lose their recognizable cultural continuity. And yet the first twist of the mystery is that they may never have been completely lost. Even popular historical sources suggest that the deportation may have been partial. Part of the population would have been taken into the Assyrian interior, while another part remained in the region or migrated toward Judah. This mixture produces a paradox. Popular narrative imagines 10 tribes erased overnight, when the real process may have been gradual, with local survivals, mixed marriages, and identity changes across generations. From this ambiguity arises a second phenomenon, the dispute over who remained. The Samaritans, for example, linked themselves to northern tribes such as Ephraim and Manasseh in their own tradition, while from the classical Jewish perspective they were often seen as the result of later population mixtures. That is, even in the land itself, northern continuity became a controversial topic, not a clear line. Over the centuries, the void was filled with historical imagination and eschatological hope. The idea of hidden tribes in remote places functions as a promise. Someday, they will return. That is why, at different times, Gog and Magog, peoples of the Caucasus, groups from Central Asia, or isolated communities, were pointed out as possible descendants. The name Lost Tribes ended up being less a verifiable genealogical category and more a symbol, the part of Israel that is missing, the piece of history that should return to complete the picture. In the modern era, this symbol took concrete form with communities claiming Israelite ancestry. A famous case is that of the Bnei Menashe in northeastern India. They consider themselves linked to a lost tribe, and following religious processes and rabbinical decisions, thousands emigrated to Israel in recent decades. It is a perfect example of how the mystery remains alive, not only as a historical question but as a current identity, real migration, and religious debate. 15. The date of the end of the world. The Bible talks about the end, but it resists giving a date as if it were a calendar fact. This resistance is not accidental. In the most frequently cited texts on the subject, a direct warning appears. In Matthew 24:36, Jesus states that about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels, and that this knowledge belongs to the Father. And after the resurrection, when the disciples ask again about the times, the answer in Acts 1:7 follows the same line. It is not for you to know the times or seasons that the Father has set by his authority. The mystery then is not only when it will be, but why the text seems to block the attempt. However, the Bible also contains apocalyptic language, lists of signs, images of tribulation, judgment, resurrection, the day of the Lord, and visions like those of Daniel or Revelation. That contrast creates a permanent tension. On the one hand, it hints that there will be an outcome. On the other, it denies a concrete schedule. The historical result was almost inevitable. Many interpreted the signs as a puzzle designed to calculate. This is where interpretative currents come in. Some read the apocalyptic passages as timeless symbols. The end would be a way of speaking about the confrontation between good and evil in any era. Others read them as staggered prophecies. Certain events have already occurred, others are yet to come, and others read them as a future narrative not yet inaugurated. The Bible, in that sense, functions as a text that allows multiple keys, enough to inspire hope, enough to ignite fear, enough to invite vigilance. This ambiguity explains why Christian history became full of failed dates. The most emblematic case of the 19th century was that of William Miller and the Millerite movement. His calculations led him to announce Christ's return for 1844, and when the date passed without event, the episode became known as the Great Disappointment. It was an enormous emotional blow for those who had reorganized their lives around a specific day, and also an example of the pattern that would repeat: numerical interpretation, public certainty, silence of the calendar. 16. The exact day Jesus was born. The problem with the exact day of Jesus' birth is that no biblical text provides it. The accounts of Matthew and Luke narrate the event, but they do not set a date, month, or season. At most, they leave indirect clues: a journey for a census, a crowded inn, a birth in Bethlehem, shepherds living in the fields and keeping watch at night. That detail about the shepherds became a kind of seasonal thermometer, but it is not proof. In Judea, shepherding practices could vary, and the text does not specify the weather, only nighttime activity. That is why, when today we speak of December 25th, we are actually talking about a liturgical date, not a documented historical date. And here begins the second mystery. Why was that date chosen? The earliest and most solid evidence of a celebration of Christ's birth on December 25th is usually linked to Rome in the 4th century. The so-called chronograph of 354, or Philocalian calendar, includes this commemoration in a context where Christianity was already growing as a public religion. Since then, two main explanations have been debated. The first, very popular, is that of substitution or competition with solar festivities. In the Roman Empire, December 25th coincided with the idea of the winter solstice in the calendar and was associated with celebrations of the sun, including the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, linked to Emperor Aurelian in various historical reconstructions. Under this hypothesis, the Church would have baptized a powerful date of the civil calendar to reframe it as the birth of Christ. The second explanation is internal and mathematical, the calculation hypothesis. In some early Christian circles, the idea spread that the conception or incarnation of Jesus occurred on March 25th, a date associated with the spring equinox in the Roman reckoning. If you add 9 months, you arrive at December 25th. This logic appears in historical discussions about how the Christian calendar was constructed, and it has one advantage: it does not need to rely on a pagan festival, but on a theological symmetry of time. Moreover, not all of ancient Christendom celebrated the same date. In the East, for centuries, January 6th held great importance as a date linked to the manifestation of Christ, and in some traditions, such as the Armenian, that date was also associated with the Nativity. And in Orthodox Christianity, many celebrate Christmas in January due to the use of the Julian calendar or its variants, which shows that the day also depends on the system of calculation, not only on history. 17. Was Jesus married? This mystery does not exist because there is hidden evidence, but because of an absence. The earliest Christian texts, used as historical foundations, do not say whether Jesus had a wife. The academic discussion itself usually starts there. The New Testament does not offer a line like "Jesus married," nor does it mention children, nor present a wife in scenes where, if she existed, you would expect to see her. The itinerant ministry, the crucifixion, the burial, the later community. In words attributed to the research around the famous fragment, Gospel of Jesus' Wife, even those who publicly presented it emphasized that the most reliable early Christian literature is silent on the matter. Silence, however, does not kill the question. It makes it more persistent because the Jewish context of the 1st century makes celibate life appear, at first glance, uncommon. Various studies on ancient Judaism indicate that marriage was widely recommended and socially valued. But uncommon does not mean impossible. There were also exceptions, and certain Jewish groups of the period practiced or promoted forms of continence. Ancient sources on the Essenes, for example, describe celibate currents and other branches that accepted marriage under strict rules, showing that the religious landscape of the time was not uniform. The mystery is fueled above all by non-canonical texts and by how their words are interpreted. The most cited case is the Gospel of Philip, a late antique Gnostic writing that speaks a lot about marriage as a spiritual mystery and presents Mary Magdalene as Jesus's koinonos, a Greek term that can mean companion, partner, or participant, and does not by itself compel a conjugal reading. The same text mentions kisses, but here too there is ritual ambiguity. Some studies connect it with symbolic practices of initiation and spiritual transmission, rather than a romantic gesture in the modern sense. Still, the debate exists because the ambiguity allows for two paths: a literal reading, wife, and a metaphorical one, companion in a mystery. Even within the academic field, there are works arguing that the Gospel of Philip does portray Jesus as married, albeit within a theological and ritual framework of its own, not as a direct historical biography. 18. The fate of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was, in the biblical imagination, more than a sacred object. It was the physical sign of a covenant, a gold-covered chest with cherubim associated with the presence of God and the most restricted place of worship. But its historical end remains shrouded in a suspicious absence. When Babylon destroyed the first temple, the account lists several objects taken as loot, and the ark does not appear on that list. It is not said that it was captured, destroyed, or hidden. It simply ceases to appear. That silence has a strange effect. It opens the door for almost any theory to seem possible. A simple option is that the ark was looted and ended up lost, melted down, or repurposed like so many treasures of the ancient world. But if that had happened, one would expect some mention, even indirectly, because the ark was the ultimate symbol of the sanctuary. That is why many suspect that it was no longer in the temple when the Babylonians arrived. In other words, the disappearance may have occurred before the catastrophe, during decades of reforms, desecrations, and political crises in Judah. The most famous tradition to fill this gap appears in a deuterocanonical text, 2 Maccabees 2. It recounts that the prophet Jeremiah, warned of the disaster, took the ark, carried it to a mountain associated with Moses, and hid it in a cave, sealing the place. The text adds a crucial detail. The site was to remain unknown until God gathers his people and shows mercy. It is a perfect solution for a biblical mystery. It explains why no one finds it and at the same time promises that it will one day reappear. Many modern summaries place that mountain in the Nebo area in present-day Jordan, although the story itself cannot be archaeologically verified. Then there is the most persistent theory outside the Jewish world: Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains that the Ark is in Aksum, guarded near the Church of St. Mary of Zion, and that no one can see it except a designated guardian. The classic narrative supporting this claim is related to the Kebra Nagast, which describes how the Ark would have arrived in Ethiopia connected to Menelik I, in a story that blends dynastic legitimation, religious tradition, and national epic. From a historical point of view, the claim remains impossible to verify because access is restricted, but its cultural power is enormous. For Ethiopia, the Ark is not a mystery, it is a living treasure. There is also a more modern shadow, the idea that the Ark was hidden along with temple treasures in secret lists, and here appears the Copper Scroll of Qumran, an ancient document that lists dozens of hiding places with gold and silver. The text does not mention the Ark as such, but it has fueled speculation that behind some deposits there could be greater relics, or that the scroll reflects a real environment of concealment in times of crisis. The only thing certain is that the Copper Scroll is indeed a list of hiding places and valuable metals, and that its existence shows that the idea of buried treasures was not far-fetched in that world. 19. Who was the Pharaoh at the time of the Exodus? The Bible narrates the Exodus with vivid details about forced labor, persecution, and flight, but avoids the fact that would be most useful to a historian: it does not name the Pharaoh. This omission, which may respond to literary or theological motives, left a perfect void for mystery. Because if there is no name, then everything depends on indirect clues, internal chronologies, toponyms, and the cross-checking with the little we know of New Kingdom Egypt. The most repeated clue is in Exodus 1:11. The Israelites are said to have built store cities for the Pharaoh called Pithom and Ramses. For many, that Ramses sounds like the Delta capital associated with the Ramesside dynasty, known as Per-Ramesu or Pi-Rameses, a major center in the northeast that was key as a capital and military platform toward Asia. That identification does not prove that the pharaoh was Ramses II, but it does push the scenario toward the 13th century BCE, when the region and the name Rameses dominated the political map. The second major piece is the Merneptah Stele, a commemorative monument that mentions a group called Israel in Canaan toward the end of the 13th century BCE. If Israel was already a reality in the land by then, the departure from Egypt would have had to occur before that reference. Therefore, in the late Exodus scheme, it is usually thought of as an exit during the reign of Ramses II or the nearby years, with Merneptah as a possible pharaoh of the subsequent period. But there is another school, equally persistent, that does not start from the toponym Ramses, but from the biblical chronology. 1 Kings 6:1 states that the temple began to be built 480 years after the Exodus. If that figure is taken literally, the calculation pushes the date toward the 15th century BCE, and that completely changes the roster of candidate pharaohs. They would no longer be Ramessides, but kings of the 18th dynasty, among whom appear names like Amenhotep II. The problem is that even within the ancient textual transmission, that number can vary, and moreover, many researchers suspect that numbers like 480 may be theological schemes rather than an archival count. 20. What became of the Holy Grail? The Holy Grail seems like a biblical object, but its mystery arises above all from medieval literature. The Bible speaks of a meal, of a shared cup, of memory and covenant, but it does not provide a reliquary with its own name, nor does it command a search. The Grail, as we imagine it today, enters the Western world through a late 12th century poem, Percival, or The Story of the Grail by Chrétien de Troyes, where the word Grail appears for the first time in Europe as a mysterious object that passes in procession through a castle, whose meaning is not fully explained. That first Grail is not yet the chalice of the Last Supper. It is a narrative marvel. It provokes astonishment, promises healing, and leaves questions. The decisive change occurs when other authors take up that mystery and Christianize it. Around the year 1200, Robert de Boron rewrites the tale. The Grail becomes the cup of the Last Supper, associated with Joseph of Arimathea, and the quest ceases to be merely a matter of chivalry to become an undertaking with spiritual weight and providential purpose. With this shift, the Grail becomes holy by definition, and it is forever linked to the Arthurian cycle and the idea of an absolute relic, lost and safeguarded. From there, the mystery splits into two currents that do not always intersect. One is symbolic, the Grail as a moral goal, as impossible purity, as the restoration of a wounded world. The other is concrete, the obsession with identifying it with a real object. And this is where the candidates appear. Among the most cited are the Sacro Catino of Genoa and the Holy Chalice of Valencia. The interesting thing is that even the most cautious historical summaries emphasize the same point. These objects have devotion, local history, and tradition, but their ancient origin is difficult to prove with absolute documentary continuity. And many of their strong associations develop after the Grail stories were already circulating in Europe. In the case of Valencia, the documentable history usually begins late. There are records placing it in the hands of the Crown of Aragon at the end of the 14th century, and later in the cathedral from the 15th century. That is to say, there may exist an ancient bowl mounted in a medieval chalice, and yet the idea that this was the cup of the Last Supper depends on a pious tradition that cannot be verified as a continuous record from the 1st century. Even with this limitation, the object became a center of pilgrimage, and in recent times it has continued to receive public and religious attention, with celebrations and narratives that reactivate the myth in a contemporary key.